Hello. Alright. I need to make this one quick because I got work in the morning. I'm making a quick one here. I'm here to talk about the Netflix movie that I've been hearing people talk about in sort of awards, artsy crowds. The movie The Power of the Dog, which, as the name suggests, is about a dog with superpowers. That's a joke. It's not about that at all. That's not what it's about. It's actually not even remotely close to being about that. The movie is about it's actually a western. They're not your typical western for sure. Definitely not a shoot 'em up type western. It's not even set in like the 19th century, which most westerns are set in. It's actually set in the early 20th century, 1925 to be exact, in Montana. The movie stars Benedict Cumberbatch as a guy named Phil Burbank, who's a cattle rancher, a very successful cattle rancher, who, he runs a ranch with his brother George Burbank, who's played by Jesse Plemons, and they run the ranch together because, like I said, they're brothers. And it's kind of hard to describe what this movie is about because it's so very subtle in everything it does, which can be kind of frustrating, but I also kind of like, because it kind of makes you work to like try to figure. It doesn't hand you everything, so you have to infer a lot about what's going on. It treats you like an adult. It allows you to like you can figure it out. It's not being dickish about it. It's going like, no, we trust you to figure this out. And if you think about it, you can. Anyways, like I said, Phil and George are cattle ranchers. They inherited their ranch from their parents, who are now in retirement somewhere else. I don't think they ever said where they were. Anyways, they have their ranch out in the middle of nowhere, and they sometimes go into this nearby town. And you can see early on that Phil is he's very the alpha of the group, of their group of them. They're successful cattle ranchers, so they also have a lot of ranch hands working with them, and he definitely leads the pack, and he's very cowboyish and alpha. Well, George, you can see, dresses a bit more in a modern way, at least, modern for the 20s. He's got more of like a suit look about him, and he's definitely not as into the ranch lifestyle as Phil is, and he seems almost out of it most of the time. And Phil obviously doesn't like that. He doesn't like that his brother doesn't seem to be so into his way of doing things. Phil's a guy who definitely likes. He's that type of guy who's like, he wants things to be a very specific way and doesn't like it if it deviates from that in any way, shape, or form. Even if it's not necessarily his place to dictate things, which is shown early on when they, the ranch where they all have dinner at this bed and breakfast they're staying at, that's run by the other main characters in the movie. Kirsten Dunst's character, or the character Rose Gordon, who's played by Kirsten Dunst, and her son, who works at the bed and breakfast as the waiter, Peter Gordon, who's played by Cody Smith McPhee. Kirsten Dunst is great in this movie. She has really become. I mean, I've seen most of her career from when she was a fucking kid. That's a weird thing to say. I think she's actually older than me, but it's weird. But I've I remember her acting when she was like a child, and now she's like a grown woman, and she's gotten really, really good. I thought she was great in this movie. This might be one of her best performances I've ever seen. Cody Smith-McPhee, he's been in a lot of things I like, and he is a good actor, but he might also be the weirdest looking human being I've ever seen. He's not even ugly. I'm not even saying that. I'm just saying he's weird looking. He's so gangly. It's bizarre because he's really tall and he's insanely skinny. He looks like fucking Olive Oil's like cousin or something. It's so fucking weird. He's the gangliest motherfucker. But that's regardless. That's just something I noticed. Anyways, the crux of this movie becomes when George, who is actually very much a side character in the whole movie, becomes attracted to and becomes very close to Rose, to the point where, like, this happens completely off screen, but he just marries her off screen. You don't even see their wedding. It just sort of happens. And he just starts going into town a lot more, which Phil does not like, and he eventually just tells Phil that he's like, oh, I married her. But Phil knows he's getting very close to this woman. He sees her as an interloper. He sees her as just some cheap, money-grubbing, worthless woman that he doesn't want around. Which is weird because it's not like she's worthless. She owns her own small business. Alright, she's not a successful cattle rancher, but she owns she's a single mother who owns a bed and breakfast. That's not bad. That's not bad for modern times. And it certainly shouldn't be bad for 1925. But regardless, George marries Rose, and Peter ends up going to college to be a doctor. He's going to medical school. That becomes important later on. So they have this scene with George and Rose where they're kind of just having tea at the side of the road, and they sort of just have this nice little moment together. There's a part where George sort of just walks away and he starts to cry, and he says to her, it's just so nice not to be alone. And you can see how very much he plays second fiddle to his brother, and how he is like almost smothered by this lifestyle he's forced to fit into. That is very much what Phil wants, but it's not what George wants. And now that he has someone else who he feels is more like him in his life, he's so much more happy. And while he's happy, Rose isn't necessarily happy because because George, while he may not have fit in with his brother's lifestyle, he grew up in this very affluent background. They mentioned early on, like, Phil, like, belittles George all the time. He constantly refers to him as Fatso as a nickname, and he must do it all the time because George is so used to it. It just rolls right off of him. And although to be fair, Jesse Plemons is a little heavy, but anyways, and George also mentions that Phil mentions that George flunked out of college at one point. And then later on, it's also mentioned that Phil did very well in college, suggesting that that might be another reason why George plays second fiddle to Phil, and why he doesn't feel he fits in, because he knows not only is he not as tough and as rugged as his brother, but he's also not as smart as him. But anyways, it's just Phil is the alpha, and right away he just lets Rose know that he doesn't like her there. He sees her as just a cheap money grubber who is just there for his brother's money and doesn't belong in this life. So he basically sets the tone between the two of them. And then he constantly mocks and belittles her and makes her feel uncomfortable in every situation. There's this point where she's trying to practice the piano because George has invited his parents and the governor and his wife to their home, and he asks if like she can play the piano for him. He even got a piano for her because I guess she used to play piano at like, you know, like the movie theaters or like whatever they were for, like movies back in those days when they had silent films. You know, they'd always have someone like playing a piano. That was her job at one point. And she goes, well, I'm not a very good piano player. He's like, it'll be fine. And she's so nervous about this, and as she's trying to practice, like you can hear Phil upstairs like playing the same tune on his banjo, basically just there to mock her because she keeps like screwing up and like having to restart. So he's just basically mocking her with his playing, and it fucks her up. Basically, you don't see the extent of it, but he fucks with her so much to the point where she just starts drinking like on a regular basis. She becomes a full-blown alcoholic. Then there's the thing where they have the actual dinner party, and Rose is just so obviously out of place there. It's not even the issues with Phil, although Phil is, you see that some of the issues isn't necessarily have to do with Rose. It's all this sort of modern, affluent, highfalutin living that's going on, and Phil, who's very much just wants to be a rugged cowboy, does not fit into it at all, and he fucking hates it. And he hates that his brother is trying to force this into his life now, and he hates that he's brought this woman who makes this a part of this. But the funny thing is, it's in that scene, it's Phil and Rose who are the most out of place, because even though Rose is trying to fit in, you can see that she is just not comfortable there, that she's not happy there, and that when she goes to try to play the piano, she just completely freezes and apologizes and says she can't do it. And then that's when Phil shows back up, just covered in fucking dirt, completely unbathed, and he just goes, and once again, he takes the opportunity to fucking mock Rose, and just further driving her into drinking. Now, this is the situation as it goes on until... And George is completely oblivious to most of this. He's a fucking idiot. He's just dumb as shit. Even though Phil has said multiple times he didn't want him around this woman, then he tried to point out how bad she was, and George just ignored it. Anyways, Peter, Rose's son, eventually comes to visit. And this is where the situation changes. Phil is also harsh on Peter. He constantly refers to him as Nancy, and he looks at him as a wimp, and you know, he refers to him as I think he referred to him as Miss Nancy at one point. Like, he's just constantly demeaning this kid, especially in front of his ranch hands, and they're just shitty as hell to this kid. But the kid, to his credit, just takes it. Remember how I said that he's studying to become a doctor? At one point, he actually catches a rabbit, and it seems like he might keep it as a pet. But then you see later he dissects it, basically just for the purposes of studying it for his medical studies. So the kid is very much an intellectual. He's a very much modern, intellectually minded kid. He's not masculine at all. He does not fit in this world, though he'll definitely play the part. And everything just goes to show more and more that Phil is just definitely the king of this rugged cowboy-esque domain. There's actually even a scene where he's like walking through his cattle, and as he's walking through, you see the herd just move apart as he comes, almost like almost like, you know, how people will part for like the king walking by. It definitely is. It's a really interesting looking scene, and you know, it's like, you got to imagine they had people just like herding the cattle, like, come on, like, move out of the way, as he was walking through. But anyways, to further get it, like, Peter obviously recognizes that his mother's not doing well here. He knows that she's got a drinking problem, though he tries to ignore it. And he knows that it's Phil that's the problem because he doesn't like Phil either. But at one point, this happened. Oh yeah. Okay. All right. Here's a little bit of a spoiler alert. I'm gonna give a spoiler alert if you actually want to watch this movie. Okay, you ready? Because this is a spoiler. We find out about halfway through the movie that the reason Phil put us on this big act is because he's gay. Yeah, he's fucking gay. That's why. He's a closeted homosexual and he's putting on this big act to try to cover up for it. We find this out because there's this character that Phil mentions early on called Bronco Henry. He was I'm guessing he was a ranch hand who taught Phil and George everything they know about ranching. And Phil kind of like deifies this guy, treats him like he was a fucking god. There's even in their barn, they even have his saddle and spurs with like a little plaque as sort of like a monument to the guy. And there's a point where you see like that Phil has this secret grove he goes to, and he goes there at one point to like sort of like bathe in the stream, which is just odd, but it's like, he has his own little place. But then another time he goes there and you see him there and he has like a fucking like a neckerchief that like cowboys would sometimes wear around their neck, but it's monogrammed with a BH for Bronco Henry, meaning it's his, and he's just sort of like weirdly draping it over his face. And then he starts jerking off with it. He like sticks it down his pants and starts masturbating with it. And I'm like, is this guy gay? And then the kid finds the grove while Phil's there, and he finds like a little hut that's in the grove, and he finds like a shoebox, and the kid opens up the shoebox, and inside it's just porn, but gay porn. It's just like old pictures of naked men, of like naked muscle men, and they also all had Bronco Henry's name written on them, suggesting that maybe Bronco Henry gave them to Phil. That maybe the reason he deifies this guy is that maybe there was something more to the relationship from when he was younger. There's also something that suggests like that happens later on. But Phil does not see that Peter saw that, but he does see that Peter's there and chases him out. Later on, they have this weird moment where Phil starts acting kind of nice to Peter. And you can see that at first he's just doing it to get under Rose's skin because he knows that Rose will be bothered by this, and he just wants to be shitty to her more. So you can see that at first he's like maybe doing this just to get the kid close so he can get under Rose's skin, and that maybe even turn her son against her, which he kind of does later on by pointing out how she's an alcoholic. He even offers to make Peter a rope. There's a scene where he shows that he's like I'm gonna make you a rope. He's like, before you leave for your next semester, I'm gonna make you, like, he's showing like putting, he's like, I'm gonna finish this rope for you. It's gonna be your rope. Anyways, so then Peter and Phil start getting much closer. He starts teaching him everything about, being a rancher. He starts making him more rugged, starts telling him to wear boots and everything. And they even go out riding together a few times. But the kid is, like I said, the kid is smart. He starts he's doing other medical stuff. He finds a cow that's died of anthrax, which I guess was a big problem for cattle. And he starts cutting pieces off of it, which you just assume is for his medical studies, because that would probably be a big thing if you were a medical student, that you'd want to study diseased, dead bodies. but you see that they get closer together, and Peter starts telling Phil shit about how he found his father dead, and they have this moment where they try to coax a rabbit outside underneath that's hiding underneath some lumber, and they start taking the logs off to see how many they have to take off before the rabbit runs out, and the logs collapse. The rabbit gets hurt, and you see that Peter like snaps the rabbit's neck, and like all these things kind of surprise Phil. Like that, there's maybe more. He starts to believe that maybe there's more to this kid, and you see that his own plan to like twist the kid starts twisting him a little bit, and he starts to like this kid more and more, and it starts to become almost like taking on an actual uncle-ish role to him. And there's a scene near the end where Rose has done something to especially piss Phil off, and her alcoholism has gotten really out of control, that it's starting to like affect her physically, and she sold a bunch of his cow hides that nobody thought he was going to want anyways, but he needed the hide strips to finish the rope. And Peter, using the knowledge that Phil gave him, has made hide strips his own. And he says, you can have mine to finish the rope. And Peter's like very grateful to him. And he's like, I'm going to finish this rope for you tonight. So Peter stays in the barn with Phil while he's finishing the rope. And when they were doing the thing with the logs and the rabbit earlier, he cut his hand. And he didn't really close the wound or bandage it, so he just has this open wound on his hand while he's doing the rope, just because he's so masculine, he just doesn't give a shit. And while he's doing this, you see like they're talking to the point where you're almost like, is Phil gonna fuck Peter? Like, is that what this has become? Is his scheme to like, you know, become close to this kid to bother Rose, or to turn Peter against Rose? Has he now gotten so ingrained into it that he's actually going to have sex with this kid? Because it almost seems like that's going to happen. They get very close. There's almost a scene where it looks like they're about to kiss. And then you see later that night where they're talking, and Phil tells a story about how when he was younger, Bronco Henry saved his life. They got caught in a snowstorm, and then he kept him warm that night by sleeping with him with body heat. And then like Peter asks, like, were you naked? And Phil just kind of like laughs to himself, and Peter like lights up a cigarette and he smokes it, and then he just like gives it to Phil like with his fingers out for him to take a drag, and then he smokes it, and then he does it again. It's like, it's this weird like subtle scene, like, are these two about to fuck? And then, another spoiler warning, the next morning it's just like nobody knows where Phil is, and you're like, what happened? And you find he's still in bed, and he seems sick, and his hand looks discolored, and it's just like, oh, did his hand get infected? Because he still hasn't fucking... The wound is still bleeding. It's like, did he just think he was going to fucking, what, alpha male his way through a fucking open wound on his hand? And then George takes him to the doctor, even though Phil, like, he's like, no, I want to give the rope to the kid, and he's just out of it. You see he's feverish and delusional. And even at the end, he's like wearing, like, he's not wearing his normal cowboy clothes, he's wearing like a suit, meaning that like he looks so different. He looks weak and just more modernish in his appearance, and it's just so weird and out of place for him. And then afterwards you see that he's died. It's like from an infection in his hand? Couldn't they just... I mean, I know 1925 is kind of old, but I think they could have treated an infection back then. Am I wrong? I don't know, actually. That seems like the time where they could have dealt with something like that. But then you find out at his funeral that it wasn't... The doctor said it came on so quickly that it wasn't... He's talking to George, and he says, it came on so quickly. He's like, I have to finish my test. He's like, but on preliminary examination? He's like, I think it was anthrax. And George is like, well, that's crazy, because Phil always went out of his way to avoid dead animals over the very fear of potentially catching anthrax or giving any of the cattle anthrax. And that's where you have to infer, that's when it hits you. Holy shit. It was the kid. It was Peter. Because remember, Peter gave him the hide strips to finish his rope, and he knew he had an open wound on his hand. Those hide strips were when he found the dead cow, he wasn't just doing that for medical research. He was cutting the hide strips off the cow to make for this very situation so he could give them to Phil. And everything just lined up so perfectly for him to do this. It was just a long, long scheme where he turned the tables on Phil, where Peter turns the tables on Phil, proving that he might not be as masculine as him, but he was definitely smarter. He was able to use all the knowledge he gained. He gained Phil's knowledge of how to be a rancher. He used that. He gained the knowledge that Phil was gay, and he used that. He intentionally played on that, especially at the end, to get him to do what he wanted. And he did all of this just so Phil would die, so he wouldn't fucking harass his mother anymore. Because at the end, it seems like Rose is way better off now that Phil is gone. Almost like a weight has been lifted off her. She seems healthier. She's not drinking anymore. She seems fine. And Peter is much happier to see that his mother is happy. So at the end, you realize that this kid is a really good son. Because, I mean, you gotta give him credit. He's a great son. He killed a dude just to make his mom happy. That's a hell of a good son. And B, he's an evil fucking genius. I mean, he took every little piece of information he could on this guy, and then just waited for the perfect opportunity to present itself to fucking spring a trap to get this motherfucker to kill himself. It's brilliant. It's really fucking brilliant. And then the title of the movie, The Power of the Dog, comes from at the end, where he's reading a Bible verse that mentions the power of the dog. I'm still not quite sure what that exactly means but I don't know. I've never understood Bible verses that well. I inferred a lot from this movie, but there's only so much I can understand. I'm not terribly bright. But I gotta say that it's a 2-hour movie, 2 hours and 8 minutes, which I appreciate because some movies are so long nowadays. I also appreciated how subtle it was, and how it's like you just have to catch the visuals of what everybody's feeling, because they don't really tell you. You just have to read their emotions, which is great. So, like I said, it trusts you to be an adult and assume what's going on based on how you can see how people are acting. So, I really liked it. I wasn't sure how I would feel about it, but I gotta say, I like this movie. The more I think about it, the more I liked it. It definitely came off, like there's a lot of like Oscar baity movies, which this one definitely feels like, that you hear people rave about and you watch and you're like, yeah, it was good. And that's how I definitely felt about this movie at first, but now the more I think about it, the more I realize the subtext of it, and it's just like, it is a really good movie. It's a very good movie. So, I really liked it. Power of the Dog. 2 thumbs up. I highly recommend it. So yeah, like I said, I gotta work in the morning, so I gotta go to bed. So that's it for me. This actually went longer than I intended. So, anywho, have a good one. Good night.